When you think about everything our nervous system has to do to keep us alive and functioning, it's just daunting. We have within our nervous system everything in our brain and spinal cord, which is referred to as the central nervous system. And then that central nervous system connects to our muscles and other organs in our body. That's known as the peripheral nervous system. And it's doing so much. As I'm standing here, I'm not even aware or conscious of all of these functions that are allowing my pupils to dilate to adjust to the darkness in the room, or the glandular secretions that are digesting my food, or the muscle tone that's allowing me to stand up, or the voluntary systems that I am aware of that is influencing my language and the movement of my hands and arms. It's just amazing that any of us can survive when you think of how complex this system is. And what is even more daunting is the fact that it's not just us. We need to produce little brains and offspring for our species to survive. So how do we take care of us and all of that huge task that is, and little offspring? Well, there's some different designs in the animal world. If you look at some reptiles, like the turtle, so it has a system where it lays eggs, and these little turtles, when they hatch, they hit the ground running, so they don't need any maternal care. The mom will find a safe place for her nest, and then she doesn't have to pay any more attention to that. So this is very efficient. She only has to really worry about herself and then the nest itself, and then can exit. Somehow these little turtles find water and they survive, some of them, enough for the species to survive. So that's one model, but it doesn't lend itself to a lot of flexibility or complexity. What if the environment changed? Could these little turtles change and adapt to that environment fast enough to rescue the species? So there was, you may want to consider it, an extreme makeover that happened a little over 200 million years ago, up to about 220 million years ago. That is a different system. So with this system, I'm going to draw what looks like a rat, because the earliest animals in this category, the mammals, were rodent-looking with kind of a long snout, tiny little animals. And this model was different in the sense that the offspring were born live, so they weren't in eggs. And you had these mammary glands that secreted baby formula, nourishment, for these animals to thrive and survive. So we've got little rats that are hanging around the mom after she gives birth. And it's interesting to think about this whole lactation issue. Maybe other vertebrates were releasing secretions, maybe even to cool eggs or bodies, and this shifted to this nourishment that's secreted by these mammary glands that help the survival of these offspring. Just amazing. Now this model requires a lot of maternal care, so it's not this drive-by parenting. The mom really has to be all in. She has to lactate and feed these offspring. She needs to keep them huddled together and protect them. So a lot is going on with this maternal care. So this is a huge shift in evolutionary strategies for raising offspring. A very interesting researcher who's no longer with us, Paul McLean, wrote extensively about this family strategy. He did a lot of his work at the National Institutes of Health. And he said, when you think about it, the defining characteristics for mammals are all kind of related to maternal or parenting experience. So he singled out nurturing with nursing behavior, and also audio-vocal communication. Those first little mammals when the offspring were mobile enough to run around, they would listen to the sounds and they could communicate back and forth. So early communication probably was related to parenting. And then maybe a surprise behavior, play. Talked about how this new maternal parental system allows for a dynamic system. And there's no better behavior than play to start to initiate that flexible, dynamic behavior, because play is unpredictable when the animals are playing together. So it's very important in kind of jump-starting this brain, because remember, these mammalian offspring, they're not hitting the ground running, they're helpless. So there's considerable assembly required for these animals. So the defining characteristics of mammals are really related to parenting experience, and that's why we call them mammals, based on these mammary glands. So that shouldn't be a big surprise. Well, what had to change in the brain to allow for all of this complex and intensive maternal behavior? Scientists have done a lot of research with rats because we can systematically look at different aspects of the brain. So we looked at a cross-section of a brain of a maternal rat. One area that has been looked at is called the hypothalamus. Now the hypothalamus is, it makes sense to start there because it's generally known for its involvement in motivator-related behaviors that are important for the survival of the species and the survival of the individual. In a lot of brain neuroscience classes, they talk about the 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and let's just say mating. That is important. All those behaviors are important for survival of these animals. So some interesting research with mama rats, where they asked the rats if they prefer cocaine, it's interesting, or pups. Mother rats that have a healthy brain generally will choose the pups. But if you damage this hypothalamus, especially an area known as the MPOA, the medial preoptic area, those moms, they shift their preference to the cocaine. So you've disrupted this caring, nurturing unit. So that's really interesting. But there are a lot of other areas of the brain. It takes a lot of brain to be an effective and efficient mother. Reward systems are involved, such as the nucleus accumbens, and some emotional kind of cortical areas, such as the cingulate, among many other areas, are involved in maternal behavior. What about humans? Well, we can't systematically look at it at the level that we can with the rodents, but some interesting work with fMRI scans with parents. Interesting in these studies, they've played sounds of crying babies to parents to see what areas of their brain light up when they're listening to their own babies crying or other babies crying. And these similar circuits light up, but some other areas that are involved in cortical awareness, internal and external, such as the insula, other cortical areas that are involved in decision making, and then all of these limbic emotional areas, because we know parenting is an emotional experience that's also involved in nurturing, that lights up. So it seems that these maternal circuits have been conserved to some extent, and maybe even a little bit more elaborate with humans that have bigger brains. And it's interesting that some research has found that the area of the brain has become larger in some of these cortical areas. The gray matter has become more intense, larger in the moms, and especially there's a correlation between the degree of love and positive emotions and the degree of change in the brain. So loving our offspring, our babies, may actually, well, there's no doubt about it, it's changing our brains. And when everything is going well and proper resources are there, it's making our brains more complex in positive ways, according to the research. We've been interested with the rodent models to look to see how the offspring may change the brain in different ways, in ways that are different than the expected on-the-nest behavior. So the on-the-nest behavior would be nursing and grouping and grooming the offspring that's so important for their healthy development. But that mom, when you think about, she's a working mom, so a rat does not have a dad in the picture. They're pretty much just sperm donors, and they have up to 12 rats. So that mom has to be very efficient. She's feeding 12 animals, taking care of them. So we've looked at foraging, their ability to find food, and certain spatial tasks. And we've found that when there are certain areas where there's food, like a yummy Fruit Loop is what we use in the lab, and we teach them that there are other potential areas, but we want to go, this is the baited area, the moms are more likely to go straight to the food and be more efficient with their foraging. But the virgin animals, or the ones with no parental experience, are more likely to have a less efficient path. So their cognitive spatial abilities are improved, and this is probably so they can get back to that nest faster, so those little helpless pups won't be a snack for a frog or a snake or another animal. We've also looked at emotional behavior and something called the elevated plus maze. And this is a maze that's elevated, as the name implies, and two of the arms are covered, so it's nice and dark and kind of safe. And the animals that are a little nervous will hang out in those covered arms. But the bolder animals will hang out they're more likely to be on this open arm. And the moms are more likely to be bolder and go out and explore there. So it seems like they have more emotional regulation that may be more efficient when they're trying to provide for these offspring. We've recently looked at stress hormones, and the moms have a healthier balance of cortisol and DHEA, with DHEA being protective to some degree. So we see healthier hormone profiles and stress responses as well, all probably to make them better moms, to take care of this huge genetic investment that is her offspring. But I've been talking about moms. What about dads? So that's interesting as well. It's also amazing that with 5,400 species of mammals, only about 3 to 5% of them engage in paternal behavior, where the dad plays an active role in raising offspring. Again, you don't see that in the rat. You don't see that with a lot of animals. Humans, yes. There's a little mouse called the California mouse that does engage in paternal behavior, and they'll crouch over and groom the little pups, and it's very efficient parental behavior. When we compare those California mice to a regular deer mouse that does not engage in paternal behavior, we've seen two neuropeptides that seem to be involved in facilitating the paternal response. And these are vasopressin and oxytocin. And these are ancient molecules that are also involved, interestingly, in fluid kind of regulation. So we know that oxytocin is involved in lactation, and that's fluid regulation, vasopressin in blood pressure, but also social species kind of recognition. So neurochemicals and brain areas, all incredibly important for maternal behavior and paternal behavior. And we look at some of the animals that are good dads, like the California mice. They show activation in some of these parental circuits that we have seen with the moms. And when I think of dads in the animal kingdom, my favorite example is this bird known as the blue-footed booby bird. And of course, I have to give it bluish feet. Now, birds are interesting in that they lay eggs, but they take care of these eggs until they hatch, and then they take care of those young hatchlings until they're proficient enough to go off and take care of themselves. So they're kind of an interesting combination, or at least a different family structure. So generally, these booby bird, the males are good dads, but when research has looked at old and young booby birds, and then they've looked at the quality of their parenting and the outcome of the brood, how many made it, survived, were they healthy, did they live to be adults? The younger dads generally are better dads when you look at those outcomes. And that makes sense because the older animals, maybe they become compromised in some way with aging. But if you temporarily make the young and the old dads sick, give them an injection of a bacteria that kicks up a fever and makes them feel bad, those old dads that weren't so great before become super dads. And their brood is more successful than the younger dads. It's called the terminal illness hypothesis. And it's as if these birds are thinking, this is my last brood, so I want to maximize the health of my genetic investment because I'm not going to have another opportunity. I don't know that birds say that, but that's kind of the idea. So this is another wonderful example, not only of paternal behavior in the animal world, but also the flexibility and response in real time to changing demands to make sure that the brood or the offspring make it to adulthood so that it can pass on its genes to the next generation. Amazing that so much of the brain goes into regulating parental behavior, and it's had such a huge impact in shifts, upgrades, if you will, or extreme makeovers in the complexity of animals. So we've talked about how parenting may enhance cognitive flexibility with spatial and foraging, emotional regulation, being able to shift demands and energy expenditures so that we have enough energy to take care of these offspring. But maybe even more interesting and exciting is that this parental design with the mammals has allowed us to move from a total self-awareness to a more other-centered awareness. So whereas we started by thinking, how in the world are we able to take care of ourselves? Everything that goes into regulating all these neural responses and digestive responses, how can we manage that and another animal? With the mammals, we are managing being attentive, not only to ourselves, toward ourselves, but toward others. So some of these characteristics that perhaps we value the most with humans, with our species, sympathy and empathy, community, it started with parenting. So parenting seems to have laid the neuroarchitectural foundation for these wonderful, complex, I'd like to say signature characteristics of some mammals, such as humans, to care for each other. And our brains have played a big role in this. So if we're thinking about the most complex brains and dynamic brains, we certainly want to consider that the parental brain is the mother of all brains.